as I suggested at the end of the last section, non-white Americans were never sitting back and saying, oh, geez, I guess I'm inferior. Oh, geez, I guess I'm just going to accept this oppression that's being put upon me. From the moment Africans were brought to America, they were resisting and trying to escape from slavery. Native Americans were adapting to Europeans living in their territory. They were fighting back. They were changing their lifestyles to adopt things that the Europeans brought that they found beneficial. Remember that the non-white communities are just as active and dynamic as the European communities are. So it's not a matter of the whites coming in, rolling over everybody else. There's this active conflict going on between the Europeans and the non-white communities that they are trying to control. The Cherokee had centuries of experience with the Europeans, and when the Revolutionary War came along, the Cherokee first sided with the British. They liked that the British were far away. They had experience with the British. They figured they were better off with the British. So they sided on the British side, fought against the Americans, and of course they lost. From 1783, when the United States was established as a diplomatic power, the Cherokee began to attempt to make treaties with the United States in the same way that they had made treaties with the British in the past. From 1783 to 1821, they made 23 separate treaties with the United States. And in every one of these treaties, the Cherokee were asking for peace and the United States were asking for land. So over time, from 1783 onward, the Cherokee ceded that land. That means they gave it up. They gave up land in South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama. The edges of their territory were traded away, and the Cherokee were increasingly centralized along the Tennessee River Valley. The Cherokee on the western side of the territory by the 1820s had given up on treaties with the United States and decided to give up their land entirely. They traded their western territory in Alabama for an equivalent amount of land in Arkansas, and a set of Cherokee emigrated to Arkansas in the 1820s. The Cherokee position was somewhat strengthened, they thought, during the Creek Wars of 1813 and 1814. The Creek were traditional enemies of the Cherokee, and so the Cherokee were happy to join up with the United States and fight against the Creek. They thought also that this would win them more power in Washington. While they're engaging in these treaties and wars, the Cherokee were also actively adapting their culture. In 1811, they took part in a movement that swept across the Eastern nations, led by a man called simply the Prophet, which was, today we call it the Cherokee Ghost Dance, but was as an idea of ceremonial practices that would help the Native Americans to resist Europeans, that would help them to maintain their culture in the face of white encroachments. The Cherokee recognized that one of the things that the Europeans respected was written documents. And in 1821, a Cherokee named Sequoyah developed a way to write the Cherokee language. Famously, he wrote a syllabary that translates the spoken Cherokee onto text, which then allowed them to establish a newspaper and allowed them to write down their own constitution. And these were steps that they believed the Europeans would look at and recognize as the Cherokee are civilized because they have newspapers, because they have a written language. Later in the 1820s, the Cherokee rewrote their entire system of government. They got rid of the Common Council and everybody agreeing on everything to write a constitution that essentially copied the United States Constitution. They implemented a Supreme Court. They adopted a three-branch style of government. They changed all sorts of elements of their culture. They began to build European style houses. They adopted European style education. They adopted a European style economy that was based more strongly on trade than it was on agriculture. And they adopted slavery. The Cherokee were taking on these European cultural characteristics all across the board. What you're seeing on the map here is the reduced Cherokee territory that they managed to hold on to by 1823. And if you look at it here, you say, oh, well, that looks like a fairly good-sized territory. This map, again, is the first one that we looked at, and the blue circle is an approximation of what they had retained, so that you can see by the 1830s, the Cherokee had lost the huge majority of their territory, but they were still able to live in peace. They were able to adapt their culture. They had a thriving community that felt secure in their territory in the mid-1820s. And that is when John Ross became a leader among their community. John Ross joined the senior council of the Cherokee in 1819, and his fluidity between the cultures allowed him to become their primary negotiator. He became the paramount chief in 1826 and really had the ability to negotiate with the Americans on their own terms. So throughout the 1820s and into the 1830s, John Ross is individually trying to be a buffer against more American encroachment. So we've got this moment in the 1820s when the Cherokee seem like they're going to be okay. While they have ceded the majority of their territory, they've centralized their community on the most important parts of their homelands, and it looks like they're going to be able to hold on to it. Meanwhile, African Americans don't have the same kind of foothold that the Cherokee did. The Cherokee had their long history of already negotiating with Europeans that allowed them to begin from a point of strength in negotiating with the Americans. African Americans, having been brought to the coast of America in chains or born into slavery, did not have the same kind of negotiating power. Their resistance tended to be far more physical because it was all they had. They did not have the legal precedent that the Native Americans did for resistance. From the earliest times that Africans came to America, they were resisting and trying to break out of slavery. In the period that we're talking about, this early Republic period, there were two major events in the enslaved community that we remember in the history books as attempts at rebellion. Gabriel's conspiracy in 1800 took place in Richmond, Virginia. It was a widespread conspiracy that Gabriel was able to spread because of his literacy, because of his connections through working in a smithy, meant that a lot of people came through, and there were ample opportunities to communicate a widespread plan for a rising on August 30th of 1800. Two men who had been taken into this conspiracy but were afraid of the outcome of it, were afraid that everybody would be killed, were afraid that it would simply go badly. Those two men revealed the evidence of the conspiracy to their owners, and Gabriel and 27 men were executed as a result of that planned rising. So this was a planned conspiracy. Nothing happened. It was stopped before it was started. The second conspiracy has some similarities to this. Denmark Vesey, because he was a preacher, because he was a leader of the Black community in Charleston, had great scope to be able to spread the conspiracy that he was accused of planning. In Charleston in 1822, Denmark Vesey was also accused of planning a conspiracy. The idea was that as a Black preacher in the AME church, he was spreading a conspiracy for a rising of African Americans all across South Carolina. Similar to Gabriel's conspiracy, this conspiracy was disclosed by people who had been taken into it by co-conspirators. It was disrupted. Vesey and other accused conspirators were hanged. There's been some question recently about whether there was actually this conspiracy or whether it was something that the white community kind of dreamed up as a way to attack Vesey and his congregation. I've heard about that. I haven't done enough reading at this point to know what the historical theory is. This conspiracy, whether it was actually a conspiracy or not, is evidence about how powerful Vesey was seen to be, that he was a leader of this community that could drive sentiment and could either convince people to be quiet and accept their enslavement or to rise up and resist it. So again, we're seeing evidence of communities in conflict with one another, that it was a white community aware of this potentially rebellious Black community. It wasn't comfortable being an enslaver in the 1820s. The result of all of these things, of the Cherokee adaptations and the Cherokee negotiations, the two conspiracies, Gabriel's conspiracy and Vesey's conspiracy, led to changes for non-white communities in the United States. African Americans found legal restrictions on them. Even free Blacks were limited in the kinds of actions that they could take in terms of free movement, ownership of firearms, things like that. Limits were placed on allowing Black people, men or women, to lead congregations. So even a Black church was supposed to have a white preacher. This is when you see the implementation of anti-literacy laws, of making it illegal to teach enslaved people to read and write, because that's one of the ways that they spread information. Limits on the ability of African Americans to gather together in numbers to travel. These kinds of laws go into place because the white community is afraid of the Black community. Native Americans don't get as much legal oppression because they are outside of the white community. They're not in the control of the white community in a way that laws can be enforced. Instead, they're suppressed governmentally. They are coerced into trading away more and more of their territories, so they become more and more condensed communities. They have to fight to be recognized as governments. John Ross is constantly going into Washington arguing for recognition of his government, and they ignore him. He sits in the lobby all day long, waiting to be able to have a conversation with someone who can make a difference for his people. So because the white Americans don't see the Native Americans as real equals, they're pushed aside, they are ignored. There's also a strain of language that gets stronger and stronger under the Jacksonian era of describing all Native Americans as savages. They look at especially the Great Plains tribes that are resisting settlement on reservations, that are continuing to attack Europeans. They take that Great Plains vision and translate it to all Americans and say, oh, because the Sioux are attacking us, that means the Cherokee want to attack us as well. all Native Americans get described as savages. And you see this very clearly in legislation in the 1830s, where they ascribe a desire for freedom to hunt and travel and roam to Eastern tribes that haven't roamed for centuries. As more and more disabilities were forced onto non-white communities, those disabilities themselves become defined as intrinsic to the race of the non-white communities. So the easiest example of this is African Americans are prevented from being taught to read, and then being uneducated or unintelligent becomes racialized as an intrinsic characteristic of those enslaved people. They take something like forcing enslaved women to give up their children to sale and racialize it as saying those women, because of their race, don't care about their children. They are willing to just give up their children. Native Americans are forced onto reservations. They're forced to live in poverty. And then it's racialized into saying, well, look at the terrible conditions they choose to live in. Look at the terrible territories that they have chosen to live on. It becomes a racialized characteristic that they live in poverty or that they live away from cities. By the 1820s and certainly by the 1830s, this racialized view, believing that people are the way they are, they achieve what they achieve because of their race, is widespread across America. It's no longer a matter of debate. By 1830, they believe that white people are in charge of America because they are white. It's intrinsic characteristics of whiteness that have allowed them to gain control of the United States. It's intrinsic characteristics of blackness that keep African Americans enslaved, and it's intrinsic characteristics of Native Americans that has kept them excluded from power and territory in the United States. And that sets the stage for all the rest of American history.